What if Dwight David Eisenhower had died from his heart attack on September 24th, 1955? On September 24th, 1955, he gets a heart attack. But what if Ike had died, as his doctors didn't take enough care of him? He died on September 30th of 55. Richard Nixon assumes the office of president, leaving the vice presidency vacant, and gets the Republican nomination in 1956 with Henry Kellogg Jr. He goes up against Stevenson and Kennedy for 1956 U.S. election. Adlai Stevenson and Estes Kefauver vs. Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Richard Nixon easily wins in 1956 with a landslide of 350 electoral votes. Nixon's cabinet Secretary of State, George Wallace, he's a Republican in this timeline. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Thomas Dewey. Vice President, Henry Kellogg Jr. Supreme Court appointments, George Romney. Secretary of Defense, also George Romney. Secretary of Interior, John McCain, who is a very young Vietnam War veteran in this timeline. The Vietnam War would break out in 1957. 1960 U.S. election, Nixon Lodge Jr. vs. Johnson Stevenson. Richard Nixon wins the election of 1960 easily. In 1964, Richard Nixon signs the Civil Rights Act. Richard Nixon would get an assassination attempt on November 22nd, 1963. However, I doubt he would be assassinated. The Democrats would go with Adlai Stevenson, and Adlai Stevenson would nominate John F. Kennedy. 1964 U.S. election, Nixon Lodge Jr. vs. Stevenson Kennedy. Richard Nixon wins re-election in 1964. In 1967, the Vietnam War only gets more wars. In 1978, the Democrats nominate John F. Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy, while the Republicans go with Henry Kellogg Jr. and George Wallace. 1968 U.S. election, Lodge Jr. Wallace vs. Kennedy McCarthy. John F. Kennedy wins in 1968. The Vietnam War would end in 1970. And in 1971, there would be no Watergate scandal, as Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal would force Nixon to resign on August 19th, 1974, becoming the first and only president to resign. 1972 U.S. election, Nelson Rockefeller vs. Kennedy Stevenson. We don't know who Rockefeller picks as his running mate. John F. Kennedy easily wins re-election in 1972. 1976 U.S. election, Stevenson Carter vs. Wallace Rockefeller. Adlai Stevenson wins 1976, continuing on John F. Kennedy's legacy. The hostage land crisis would still happen in 1989, but it would end within 1981. There would be like a financial crisis or a depression, but not as bad as the 1929-1939 Great Depression. In this timeline, there would be a depression in 1981, but it quickly recovers, and Stevenson is getting all the credit for it. And although Ted Kennedy does challenge him, Adlai Stevenson wins renomination and decides to go with Ted Kennedy instead of Jimmy Carter as his running mate. 1980 U.S. election, Bush-Anderson vs. Stevenson Kennedy. Adlai Stevenson wins re-election in 1980. The Persian Gulf War would happen in 1982, as well as he would raise taxes. 1984 U.S. election. Kennedy Muskie vs. Anderson Reagan. Ted Kennedy barely defeats John Anderson, continuing on Stevenson's and John's legacy with 288 electoral votes. Not that much to say about his presidency, other about the polls in Gulfport and the fact that he lowers taxes, even though he raises tailors. 1988 U.S. election. Kennedy Muskie vs. Reagan Dorr. Ted Kennedy wins re-election in 1988. Ted Kennedy would have a good second term, extremely good second term, as the economy would recover from a Great Depression that would so happen in 1985. It would end in 1987. And many banks start to recover as the Depression ends. Even though that a couple hundred people do lose their lives because there are no homes and no food and no water, Ted Kennedy is still popular. 1992 U.S. election. Mondale, Florida vs. Dorr Quayle. Walter Mondale wins the election of 1992. 1996 U.S. election. Mondale, Florida vs. Bush Robertson. Walter Mondale wins in a landslide in 1996, winning re-election. 9/11 would happen 1 year earlier in 1999. And it seems like it's going to continue going on until September 11th, 2001. 2000 U.S. election. Clinton Buchanan vs. Florida Dorr. Bill Clinton, who is a Republican in this alternate timeline, wins against Geraldine Florida with 388 electoral votes. Easily. Bill Clinton would lower taxes and beef up military spending. Bill Clinton's cabinet. Secretary of State, George W. Bush. Secretary of Health, George H.W. Bush. Secretary of Defense, Dan Quayle. Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Pat Buchanan. Vice President, Pat Robertson. Supreme Court appointments. Maybe someone like John McCain or Mitt Romney. 2004 U.S. election. Gore. Winfrey vs. Clinton Robertson. Bill Clinton wins the election of 2004. Despite 9/11 continually going and the 2008 Great Recession, he is still popular. 2012 U.S. election. Obama-Biden vs. Kane vs. Bush Quayle. Barack Obama wins 2008 with 399 electoral votes. Barack Obama would withdraw all the troops from Afghanistan and Iraq and overseas and beef up military spending. He would get an assassination attempt in 2011, but miraculously survived. 2012 election. Obama-Biden vs. McCain-Romney. John McCain, who's a popular war hero, does help the Republicans make a comeback, but Obama is still popular to win re-election. Obama gets a second assassination attempt in 2015, but again survives. 2016 U.S. election. Kasich Bush vs. Biden Clinton. it's a tough race, but Joe Biden wins 2016. The COVID-19 pandemic would happen in 2019, but it would stop in 2021. A year earlier in 2018, the Democrats win the Senate and House. 2020 U.S. election, Biden-Clinton vs. Rubio-Bush. Joe Biden, however, literally messes up his campaign as he loses the first, last, the middle, and the second last, and the fifth last, and the first debate. Marco Rubio's campaign focused on energy prices, making cars less expensive, and continuing the legacy of Bill Clinton, which many people liked, which is how Rubio was able to win. COVID-19 pandemic would finally come to a stop. Rubio would withdraw the rest of the troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, which Obama weren't able to do. 2024 U.S. election. Rubio Kasich vs. Harris Wars. Kamala Harris wins 2024. Thanks for watching this video. Subscribe.